Greetings, everyone. I'm out here trying to kill another turkey. In my state, you can kill 2 per season, 1 per day, but I don't think it's gonna happen today. We only got a few days left of the season. It's early May, but unless you've got some farmland where turkeys come in there pretty regular, I think that's about the only way you're gonna kill one here. They're not gobbling anymore. I'm pretty sure all the hens have been bred. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised to see some poults running around here pretty soon. It's gotten hot. It's no longer, we're already in the 70s first thing in the morning, high 80s, early 90s by the middle of the day. So in my experience, that pretty much winds it up. But anyway, I'm sitting out here, I finally got a little tripod, so my plan was to try to film, a hunt if I could do it. But I was out here and I was thinking about a story that I read when I was doing some research one time, and I thought it was a pretty cool story, and so I wanted to share it with you. So if you're not familiar, most people have heard of the French and Indian War. French and Indian War starts in 1754. It's actually started by George Washington, which is, most people would say is an interesting coincidence. I tend to think there might be something a little more, supernatural about that. But he starts this war, and of course, in a couple of years, it turns into a huge global war. And the global war we call the 7 Years' War, but in America we call it the French and Indian War. And but the war started because France had built a fort called Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio River, where the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers come together. And this is where present-day Pittsburgh is. And so anyway, in 1755, a British army led by General Braddock, Edward Braddock, they had planned to go basically attack the French fort, remove the French from the area. Of course, George Washington accompanied Braddock on this expedition, and also Daniel Boone was on this expedition, and we can talk more about that later. It's not really the point of this story. But Braddock was bringing this big army, this British army that wasn't really accustomed to the way fighting was in North America, and the expedition ended up being a disaster. And I am going to make a video about that on another day because it is a very significant story in American history. But the story I want to talk today is about a man named James Smith. James Smith was from Pennsylvania. He was very young when this war started, and there was a girl he wanted to marry, and he needed money to marry the girl. And so he hired on with this Braddock expedition as a woodcutter, because Braddock was bringing cannons. He had these big supply wagons, and this was in the American wilderness, so he needed a road built to move his equipment. And this became known as the Braddock Road. But this guy, James Smith, he was a woodcutter, so he was sort of moving ahead of the expedition, cutting down the trees, moving the stumps, so the army could move through. And of course, if you don't know, the Braddock expedition was a failure. The British/American forces were ambushed by French and French allied Indians, and it was a disaster. Braddock died. A lot of the other British officers died, and in fact, George Washington became the hero of the battle because he sort of is the guy who rallied the troops and all that when all the other officers died. And of course, it was a retreat. It was a French victory, but George Washington sort of becomes a national hero, and I say national in the cultural sense, not in the political sense, because the United States didn't exist yet. But anyway, so during this disaster, James Smith gets captured. He gets captured by the Lenapes. Lenapes are sometimes referred to as the Delawares, right? So the Delaware Indians or the Lenape Indians. And they take him to Fort Duquesne, and basically sell him to the French, and eventually he's adopted by the Mohawks. And so, to make a brief point on that, when you were captured by American Indians, especially in the eastern woodlands, you essentially had a few choices of what was going to happen to you. You could be sold for ransom. You could be tortured to death in a very agonizing way. That was actually common for men. Male captives were usually tortured to death. And this wasn't to be cruel, it was cruel, but it was done in a cultural understanding of balancing spiritual power. So the Indians did have a sort of spiritual outlook on why they tortured these people. We'll have to talk more about that later, because that can get controversial. But another option was they could adopt you, and adoption meant that you were a full member of the tribe. You were one of them. Didn't matter what your skin looked like, didn't matter who your parents were. If you were adopted, you were a full-blooded Indian of the tribe that adopted you. And so Smith gets adopted by the Mohawks. So by Mohawk standards, he is now a Mohawk. But it wasn't uncommon for adoptees to escape or try to escape. And so Smith, he's allowed to go hunting. Hunting is a big part of American Indian masculinity. But he has to be supervised on his hunts initially. Now, he's going to be captive till the end of the war. And when I say captive, he's a member of these Mohawks. Until the end of the war, he does eventually escape towards the end, but he gets captured by the French. But it's not long after he's captured by the French that the war actually ends in America, and he gets turned back over to the British. But anyway, he spends 4 years living with these Indians. And so he's living as an Indian, he's hunting with them, doing Indian things. And so one day he's out hunting with the Mohawks, and they come across some buffalo tracks. Now, buffalo, most people are familiar with buffalo. When I say buffalo, I'm talking about bison, right? I use the term buffalo because in the historical record, they're called buffaloes, all right? But bison, okay? We think of bison as a Western animal, as a plains animal, but at the time of European contact, bison were all across the United States. So, Georgia had them, North Carolina had them, New York had them. So buffalo were pretty prevalent in the East. Of course, they got hunted out just like they did in the West, but they were still around during the French and Indian War. And so James Smith is hunting with these Mohawks, and they come across these buffalo tracks. And he's excited because he thinks, hey, here's, buffalo, that's a lot of meat. But he said the Indians that he was with got real nervous. And he didn't really understand why they were being so nervous. And they're following these buffalo tracks, and they're creeping along, they're being very cautious. And they come to some sand where it's very obvious that these are buffalo tracks. And he says, what is the problem? I mean, this is obviously buffalo. And the Indians told him to hush. They said, you don't know what you're talking about. They said it could be the Catawbas. Now, the Catawbas were from North Carolina, all right? So we're talking about the Mohawks, so we're talking about up north, western New York, western Pennsylvania, up into the Great Lakes area. Maybe, a little bit of southern Canada. But these Catawbas are from what today we would call North Carolina. And they said, maybe these are Catawbas. And one thing you got to understand, I see these things pop up sometimes on social media, and it'll be a map, and it'll show like, oh, this is where this Indian tribe lived, and this is where that Indian tribe lived, and this is this Indian tribe. Those maps there's a lot of problems with those maps. For one, not all Indian nations existed at the same time. So when I look at those maps, I'll see Indians that were basically extinct as a people, coexisting with Indians that didn't even exist yet, right? So there's some Indian tribes that don't even exist until the 19th century, and they'll be on the same map with Indians that were extinct in the 17th century. And I hate to say that word extinct because it sounds like animals, but what I mean is that nation is dissolved. That nation has ceased to exist. Anyway, so, but another problem with these maps is these Indians didn't stay in one place. They moved around, all right? They weren't nomadic, but they were semi-nomadic. They would move with the seasons, but they would travel great distances to go hunting, and they would travel great distances to go to war. So it wouldn't be strange for Indians from New York to be fighting a war against Indians from North Carolina. They would literally walk, you know, all the way across the United States, essentially, the north to south, to fight. And so these Mohawks get very nervous, and they say this could be Catawbas. And you know, these are buffalo tracks. So Smith gets kind of confused, and they tell him a story. And they said one time some Catawbas snuck up close to our camp, and they tied buffalo hooves to their feet, and they walked all around the camp with these buffalo hooves strapped to their feet. And so when we woke up, we said, hey, during the night, some buffalo passed through here. We're going to go hunt them. So they go after these buffalo tracks, tracking them down. And they walked into a Catawba ambush. So the Catawbas had deceived them with these buffalo hooves, so that when the Mohawks followed the tracks, lo and behold, the Catawbas ambushed them. All right. So, of course, the Catawbas kill several of these Mohawks. The rest of them flee. They sort of run back to their camp, and meanwhile the Catawbas leave. Well, when the Mohawks get back to the camp, they say, hey, we got ambushed by the Catawbas. They tricked us. And so they rise a war party. They gather up more men to now go fight these Catawbas. So the Catawbas have ambushed these Mohawks. Now they're leaving, and now the Mohawks are in pursuit of these Catawbas. Well, this is where the story gets really cool. You know, the buffalo hoof thing's pretty cool, but this is where it really it makes its mark. Okay, so the Catawbas had captured rattlesnakes and milked the venom out of them. And they had taken shards of river cane and cut them so that they were very sharp, and they had dipped them in the rattlesnake venom. And after they had ambushed the Mohawks as they were leaving, they hid these sharpened stakes in the grass with the rattlesnake venom on them. So, and they left a very obvious trail which way they were going. So now the Mohawks are pursuing the Catawbas. And the Catawbas have left these booby traps, these sharp shards of river cane with rattlesnake venom on them, sticking up in the grass. And so as the Mohawks are now chasing the Catawbas, they step on these bamboo shards or these river cane sharps and get essentially bit by rattlesnakes. It's an artificial snake bite, but the effect is the same. And so now all these Mohawks are injured with snake venom, and they're in pain, and you know, as James Smith puts it, lame. And the Catawbas turn around and come back and then kill all those Mohawks and scalp them. So it was like a double ambush. They tricked them with the buffalo hooves. And then as the Mohawks went to find the buffalo, they ambushed them. Then they fled, knowing the Mohawks would go get more men. And then they basically drew them into this trap with this bamboo, this river cane venom dipped in rattlesnake venom. And then these guys get injured by those, and then they come back. They basically ambush them again and scalp them. And I just thought, man, that is a crazy story. I mean, that makes me proud, you know, to study history, and I marvel at, you know, some of the ideas these people came up with. The Catawbas were normally, for the most part, they were allies of the English colonists down in the Carolinas. There was one event called the Yamasee War, where the Catawbas did fight against the settlers for a little bit. But that story, it just, you know, I thought it was really cool, and I wanted to share it with you guys. And that's not, man, I've got a lot of stories of stuff like that. That story, I was researching it for a book. It didn't really fit into what I was writing about, but I said, I can't let that story go to waste. So I've told people about it over the years, and I was like, man, I'm gonna, while I'm sitting here not listening to turkeys gobble because they're not gobbling, I thought I'd share with you. So if you liked it, please let me know in the comments, and I got more stories. So thank you.